right, today we're going to talk about another one of my favorite topics, and this is conditional statements. You may have heard them before when referring to the logic game section, or maybe you have some practice with them in the past, but they're also very common in the logical reasoning section, but sometimes they can be a little bit more difficult to recognize than in the logic game sections when we're doing our rules. So don't be intimidated by conditional statements because you see them every day in everyday life. You probably have seen them and you don't even recognize that you've seen them. For example, if I said, if I win the lottery, then I will be happy. What does that mean? It means exactly what it says, right? If I win the lottery, so if I'm going to have a sufficient condition, winning the lottery is enough to know that I will be happy. This is a great example. It triggers it, right? If I'm not happy, what do we know? I must not have won the lottery. So conditional statements are also referred to as these if-then statements as just referenced. And what this means is if we know one condition, it is enough to trigger something else. So if this, then we know this. If condition, then this. So if I said, if I live in Ohio, then I live in the United States. Isn't living in Ohio sufficient for knowing that I live in the United States? Absolutely. Or what if I said, if I am an apple, then I am a fruit? Don't all apples have to be fruits? Absolutely. Or what if I said, all kids must go to school? What does that mean? We want to translate that from all kids must go to school into an if-then statement. So it's going to say, if I am a kid, then what? I must go to school. Excellent. And so when we have these if-then statements, they have fancy words that we're referring to when it comes to conditional logic. So if refers to our sufficient condition. And I like to remember this because sufficient has an F in it, and so does if. So if, sufficient, and those are going to go on the left side. Then our then condition is what we call necessary. And I like to remember this one because then has an N in it, and so does necessary. And so when it comes to describing what these words mean, sufficient just means enough or to trigger. Where necessary just means needed. Some people like to use the word requires or maybe depends on. It's something that we have to have. And then if you ever forget what side they go on, I like to remember that sufficient ends in T, and I can draw an arrow for my T so I know sufficient triggers my necessary. And so once again, if I know I am from Ohio, isn't that sufficient to know or enough to know that I'm also from the United States? Absolutely. All right, so let's go on to what we also call our contrapositive. So we have our if-then statements, right? So if we have if A, then B. So this is our original if-then statement. Well, with our contrapositives, it's the same thing, just written in a little bit different way. And I like to remember it whenever we do our contrapositive is we have to flip it and we have to reverse it. So is anybody familiar with this song? So we have to flip it and reverse it. So always remember that. And so what does that mean? So I'm going to draw this again over here. So if A, then B. We have to flip it. So we're going to flip sides. So it's going to be B and then A. And then we have to reverse it. And what that means is we have to negate it. So this is going to become if not B, then not A. And these two things are synonymous with each other. And so for maybe an easier example so that we can see this in real life, if we go back to, if I'm from Ohio, then I must be from the United States. What is my contrapositive of this statement? So remember, we have to flip it So it's going to be US, then Ohio, and then we have to reverse it. So that just means if I'm not from the United States, then I can't be from Ohio. And that's true, right? What sometimes people like to do is when they forget to flip it and reverse it, is they'll say something like, oh, I'll just flip it. And they'll be like, oh, so if I'm from the US, then I'm from Ohio. But that's not necessarily true, right? Being from Ohio isn't sufficient to trigger being from Ohio as well, or being from the United States is not enough to trigger being from Ohio as well. There's 49 other states that you could be from, right? So if we went back to our original up top here, there's other states that are sufficient, or other things that are sufficient for being from the United States. Or if we think about it in terms of our fruit example, where earlier I said, if I am an apple, then I am a fruit. Can I say that if I am a fruit, then I am an apple? No, because just because I'm a fruit, that doesn't guarantee that I'm an apple. There's many other things that would guarantee that I'm a fruit. I could be a watermelon, I could be an orange, I could be a banana, I could be a pineapple. Any one of those things is sufficient for being a fruit. So being a fruit doesn't guarantee anything for us. So today we're going to talk about for Conditional Statements 101, we're going to really focus on if that introduces a sufficient condition. We're going to focus on only if that introduces a necessary condition. And at the end, we're going to briefly talk about if and only if that is going to introduce both. So what this looks like then is we're just going to practice diagramming for a quick second. So go ahead and try diagramming these. All right, so we know that if introduces sufficient, so it goes on the left. So if A, then B, and then what is our contrapositive of that? If not B, then not A. And then for the second one, we have if A, so if A, then not C, so I'm just going to cross it off, and the contrapositive of that would be if C, then not A. Hopefully that's what you got as well. And then I have just a couple more for us to try, so go ahead and try these on your own and see if you're able to diagram. Go ahead and diagram the conditional statement as well as the contrapositive. All right, so for number one, we have if not A, so I'm going to do if not A, then B. And the contrapositive of flipping and reversing that is if not B, then A. All right, so for number two, if not A, so we're going to do not A. Trigger is then not C. All right, and then if I flip it and reverse that, I'm going to have if C, then A. All right, and then for number three, remember sufficient just means enough. So we have A is sufficient. So if A, then it says B is necessary, so B is needed. So if A, then B, and then the contrapositive is if not B, then not A. And then lastly, this one was a little bit tricky. It's asking for first the contrapositive of if A, then B. So first, our contrapositive would be if not B, then not A. And then the contrapositive of the contrapositive would be what the original statement said, and that would just be if A, then B. Awesome. All right. So let's focus in on whenever we see sentences in an LR section, what does that mean? And so we have to really pay attention to what is introducing our sufficient condition. And remember, if introduces our sufficient condition. And so in both of these situations, we have if followed by a statement. And remember, it's what introduces our sufficient. So in both of these, it's going to go on the left side. So on top, we have if I win the lottery, then I will be happy. And on the bottom, we have I will be happy if I win the lottery. So once again, what directly follows if is still our sufficient condition. We're saying the exact same thing here. So if I win the lottery, then I will be happy. So it doesn't necessarily matter the order that the sentence is in. We really have to pay attention to those trigger words. All right, so go ahead and try diagramming this one on your own. All right, so once again, we have if as introducing our conditional statement. So if opportunity doesn't knock. So I'm going to say, okay, so opportunity knock, and then cross it off, right? Because it's saying if it doesn't knock, then triggers to build a door. And then what would our contrapositive be? Yeah, if we don't build a door, then opportunity must have knocked. Fabulous. So what makes sufficient and necessary conditions challenging is not all of the statements start with if. It can also start with some common ones are all, any, each. So if I said something like, any person that goes to the gym will feel better. I'm saying any person, right? So I know that if you are any person that goes to the gym, that's enough to trigger feeling better. Or what about if I said whenever? So whenever it is hot outside, we must get ice cream. Or I could say wherever. So wherever there is grass, you must mow. I hope that this makes sense. We're going to see what this looks like here. So here is a way of saying heroin is addictive in a couple different ways, but all of these are diagrammed the same. So we have our basic if-then statement. So if it's heroin, then it's addictive. But we also can say this as any heroin is addictive. So once again, any. So if it's heroin, we know it's addictive. No heroin is not addictive. So this is the same thing as saying if heroin, you're addictive, right? Because this is like saying if you're not addictive, you can't be heroin, which is our contrapositive. And then our last one, so long as it's heroin. So if it's heroin, it's addictive. All right, go ahead and try diagramming this one on your own. All right, did everybody catch that we actually have two conditional statements here? So every introduces one. So every introduces sufficient. So if I am a great person, what does that mean? Every great person is hard on themselves. So hard on themselves. And then our second one is a small person. So if you are a small person, then you are hard on others. And so what would be our contrapositive of these? This first one would be if I'm not hard on themselves, or if you are not hard on yourselves, then you are not a great person. And then on the bottom one, it would say, if I am not hard on others, then you are not a small person. Fabulous. All right, go ahead and try this one. All right, so once again, we have two conditional statements going on here. And so when introduces sufficient. So when it rains, so I know when it rains, then you look for rainbows. So when it rains, you look for rainbows. The contrapositive would be if you're not looking for rainbows, it didn't rain. And then our second one, we have when again, which introduces a sufficient. So when it's dark, what do? We look for stars. And if we're not looking for stars, then it must not be dark. All right, so now we're going to move on to only if. And so if you notice here, if is what we have been mainly practicing so far, where if introduces a sufficient condition, where sometimes a sentence will actually introduce a necessary condition. And only if is an example of a necessary condition. And so if we diagram if it rains, so if raining, then bring jacket. So I'll say jacket. So our necessary condition in number 1 is the jacket, where only if introduces our necessary condition. And remember, necessary goes on the right. I like to remember only if introduces necessary because it has an N in it, just like necessary has an N in it. So only if it's raining. So I know raining is going to go on the right side and be our necessary condition. So our sufficient condition is going to be rain boots. So if I were to turn this into an if-then statement, it would say, if I'm wearing rain boots, then it must be raining. So we can see the difference between these two sentences. So go ahead and try diagramming this one and see how you do. All right, did we all catch our only if here? And remember, only if has the N, so we're introducing our necessary condition. And so our necessary condition is you surround yourself with people that will lift you higher. And so then our sufficient condition is feeling good about yourself. So if you feel good about yourself, that's going to be trigger or guarantee that you surrounded yourself with people that lift you higher. And so what happens is if you don't surround yourself with people that lift you higher, so I'm going to cross this off, that is sufficient for knowing that you must not feel good. And so we can see here how only if introduces our necessary. And so here is a stimulus from the LSAT on PT 22 that we can practice to see the difference between if and only if. So I want you to go ahead and read this stimulus and try to diagram it on your own. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this one. So it says, a recent survey showed that 50% of people polled believed that elected officials should resign if indicted for a crime, whereas 35% of people believe that elected officials should resign only if they believe they are convicted of a crime. Therefore, more people believe that elected officials should resign if indicted than believe they should resign if convicted. So this is actually a flaw question, which we haven't covered yet. But I just really like this stimulus for us to practice diagramming. And so here we say, so how do we diagram this first sentence? 50% of people polled that elected officials should resign if. So remember, if introduces our sufficient condition. So if indicted for a crime, so I'm going to do if indicted for a crime, then what? You should resign. Excellent. So we got that so far? Perfect. And then remember, only if introduces necessary. And so that's going to go on the right side because it's our necessary condition. So only if directly follows it is convicted of a crime. So I'm going to have convicted of a crime. And what is our sufficient then? Resign. Excellent. And so this ends up being a flaw question because you can see that resign is in different categories, but we will cover that later. And then lastly, if you did diagram this last sentence, it just says that more people believe that elected officials should resign if indicted for a crime than that should resign if convicted. If convicted. So essentially what this is saying, if you did try to diagram, is more people believe that elected officials should so if indicted, you should resign. More people believe this. I'm just going to do a more than sign. Then you should resign. If convicted, you should resign. All right. And just like sufficient conditions, there are more conditions than just only if and only that brings in necessary conditions. Some of the most common ones are relies on, depends, actually a lot of them are very common. Needs, must, requires. We will talk about some of these down here later, but really paying attention to common ones are important. In here we can see, just like with the sufficient conditions, how we are able to get to the same diagram. Only heroin, so only, remember, this is going to introduce our necessary condition, is addictive. So if you are addictive, we know you're heroin. And other ways that we can get there is only if, the only. And just to make a note on the only real quick, we'll talk about this later either. The only is the only time that only introduces a sufficient condition. We'll talk more about what that means later, but here you can see the only addictive drug is heroin. So the only here is going to introduce sufficient. So if you are addictive, then you must be heroin, where typically, if we notice, only introduces the necessary. But I like to remember it as the only is the only time that only introduces sufficient. All right, so go ahead and try diagramming this one. So we're saying what you lack in talent. So I'm going to say lack in talent. Must. So must is what's going to be introducing our necessary condition here. And we have 3 necessary conditions, right? We must be made up with desire, we must hustle, and we must give 110% effort. So all 3, so if we lack in talent, we have to have those things. All 3 of them are necessary. All right, and then finally we're going to talk about the difference between only if and if and only if. So remember, if introduced sufficient, only if introduced necessary. Well, if and only if actually introduces both. So if we go back to our example here of only if, it says, I wear rain boots only if it is raining. So only if introduces our necessary. So I'm going to put raining on the right side. If I wear rain boots, it's going to be my sufficient. Where if and only if, since it introduces both, it's actually a double arrow. And so what this means is if I wear rain boots, if and only if it's raining. And so that means that if I'm wearing rain boots, it's sufficient for knowing it's raining. Or I actually could write this the other way and say, if it's raining, I must be wearing rain boots. And so just to practice this, if I said something is an A, if and only if it is a B, how would we diagram that? It would just be A, double arrow, B, which is the same thing. I'm just going to draw it for you to see, though. It's like you also technically could do B, double arrow, A. Or our contrapositives of these then would be if not A is sufficient to know that it's not B, and vice versa. So these ones we don't flip, right? Because either way, it's the same thing. If you have A, you have B. If you don't have A, you don't have B. If you have B, you don't have A. And what this might look like is if all A's are B's. So if I'm an A, every single A is a B. And if I'm not a B, then I can't be an A. All right, so lastly, let's try one more of these before we move on. To go ahead and try diagramming this one. So we have if and only if here. So something is living, if and only if. So we get to put our double arrows, something is breathing. And so what this means is we also could say if something is breathing, that's sufficient for knowing that it's living. Or if we negated it, if something is not living, then we know it's not breathing. And if something is not breathing, it is not living, because we have our double arrows going on here. Oh, I forgot. We have one last thing, and this is and or an or. And we'll just move through this kind of quickly, and we'll practice this more later. But we have to really practice this when it comes to our conditional reasoning, where if we have both of these things, so if dogs and cats. So what this is saying is if I have dogs and I have cats, so I must have both of these. If I have dogs and I have cats, then I also have fish. The tricky part about flipping it and reversing it with and is our and becomes an or. So I have to remember flip it. So I'm going to put fish over on the left side, and I'm going to put dog and cat on the right side. But whenever I go to reverse it, I negate my fish, but instead of and, my and becomes an or. And so what this means is that if I don't have fish, that is sufficient for knowing that I for sure did not have a dog or I didn't have a cat. I might not have had either, but technically couldn't I have a dog? Because if I have a dog and a cat, then I have fish. But just a dog is not enough to have a fish. And if we look at this the other way, if I said if lions or not cheetahs, so I'm going to say if lions or not cheetahs, then I have pandas. So how would we flip and reverse this one? So we want to flip it first, and we're going to have L and C over here, and we're going to put P on the left side. And then we have to negate it, right? So we're going to negate the P. And then what do you think we're going to do to this or? Our or is going to become an and. And then I have to flip my letters. So L is going to become not L, and then not C is going to become C. And so this is now saying that if I'm not a panda, then I am not a lion and I'm a cheetah. Do we see how that happened? I can go through that one more time just in case. So this is saying if lion, so if I'm a lion, I'm going to make this with a smaller size pen. If I am a lion, or, so I'm going to put or in here, or I'm not a cheetah. So either one of these is enough to trigger that I'm a panda. So technically we could write this actually like if L is enough on its own, since we only need one of them, is enough to know that I'm a panda, or not being a cheetah is enough to know that I'm a panda. And so if we go back up to the top here and we flip this and reverse it, I'm going to flip it first. So I'm going to put P on the left side, and then I'm going to put L and C on the right, and then I have to negate it. So if I'm not a panda, then I'm not a lion, and, because our or becomes an and, I'm a cheetah. Which, if we look at how we split it here at the bottom, if I were to flip this would say if I'm not a panda, then I'm not a lion, which we have here. And it would say if I'm a cheetah, then I'm not a panda, which we would have, oh, sorry, I did a false negation. If I'm not a panda, then I am a cheetah, which we would have here. All right, go ahead and try 3, 4, and 5 on your own. All right, so number 3 says, if not cherries and not bananas. So if I'm not cherries and I'm not bananas, then I am ice cream. And then my contrapositive would be, if I am not ice cream, then I am a cherry, or I am a banana. Right? Number 4 says if on a diet, so if diet, then not cookies or not brownies. So then if I have brownies and I have cookies, then I am not on a diet. And then 5 says, if it is raining, then we will go to the basketball game and not go to the parade. So then our opposite would be if we go to the parade or we don't go to the basketball game, then it is not raining. All right, so for this last one, if is going to introduce our sufficient condition. So if you can do what you do best and be happy, you're further along than most people. So hopefully you diagram this one as if you can do what you do best and be happy, then you're further along than most people. And then hopefully for your contrapositive, you got that if you're not further along than most people, then either you are not doing your best or you're not happy. And then for the bottom one, when it says to be further along in life than most people, you must, must is going to introduce our necessary condition. Do what you do best or be happy. So our necessary condition is best or happy. Got that or in there. Our sufficient condition, then is going to be to be further along in life. And then if we were to negate this, it would say that if you are doing your best and you are happy, then you are if you are not doing your best and you are not happy, then you are not further along than most people. All right, and then our last one, I promise, our last slide here is to go ahead and practice these 3 stimuluses that come directly from an LR section. All right, so for number 1, hopefully you got all of them, all young people. So if you are a young person, then you are happy. Being young assures happiness. So if you are young, I'm going to go ahead and connect this because it's the same thing. We're talking about young people. Being young ensures happiness. A young person is a happy person. Do we see how all of those ended up saying the same thing and we could say them in different ways? Hopefully we caught that. And then for number 2, it says to classify a work of art as truly great, it is necessary that the work have both originality and far-reaching influence upon the artistic community. All right, so to classify a work of art as truly great, that work of art must have both of these things. So it must have originality and it must have far-reaching influence. And so if it doesn't have just one of those things, so if it doesn't have originality or it doesn't have far-reaching influence, then it can't be truly great. And then lastly, for number 3, it says, although the charter of Wynn School states that the student body must include some, so at least one student with special needs, no students with learning disabilities have yet been involved. Therefore, the current... Okay, so I just wanted us to diagram this first sentence here, where it says, although the charter states that a student body, so if it's a student body, it must have at least one student with special education needs. And then our next sentence says, no students with learning disabilities have yet enrolled in the school. So this is like saying, if you are enrolled in the school, so enrolled in school, then you do not have a learning disability. or if you have a learning disability, then you are not enrolled in this school. All right, I hope this was a fun first introductory lesson to conditional reasoning or conditional logic. And go ahead and take this quiz to see how you do. And then we'll move on to phase 2 of conditional statements.